Good evening. I'm Jennifer Larson. I'm Chair of Programming for Friends of Chamber Music of Troy, New York. And on behalf of Friends of Chamber Music, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Performance in Context with violin maker Joseph Curtin. All of our offerings this season are free, thanks to the many donors and sustainers. You're able to make a donation from our website, and I believe we will also you'll be able to find information in the chat box. Before we start, I'd like to introduce the president of Friends of Chamber Music, Julia Alsaraf. She is the tech behind the scenes and can assist you with any difficulties.
Hi, everyone, and welcome again. Thank you all for being here. I am going to put my email address and a Friends of Chamber Music phone number that you can reach by text or phone if you're having any issues during the event, any tech troubles. And without further ado, we will keep this moving along.
Thank you, Julia. At any point during the interview, you can put a question in the chat box or in the Q&A, and I will try to keep my eye on it. And if something comes up that fits right into the conversation, I'll insert it then. At the very end, Julia will allow you to turn your video on and unmute, and you can ask Joseph Curtin questions in person. So I'd like to welcome Joseph Curtin to tonight's Performance in Context. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Julia. It's a delight to be with you.
I'm so excited. I hope I don't bungle anything. I'm going to start with some questions about the violin in general. Can you tell us a little about how it works?
Well, let me grab one. So basically we have the bowed string. When you play, let's say, an open A string, you have a little kink that's racing up and down the string 440 times a second. Every time it hits the bridge, it sends a little pulse of energy down the bridge into the top, and then it excites the many resonances of the violin. There's several hundred in the sort of the musical frequency range. Now, just how their frequencies and amplitudes and many other things, how much sound they radiate from each one is very complicated, and that's one of the reasons that making violins, especially with a very variable material like wood, is not an easy thing. It takes a fair bit of experience and a fair bit of judgment to sort of tweak everything and make it work acoustically. But the workings of the violin are usually divided into the bowed string, which is actually very complicated, and then the movements of the body, and then the sound radiation of the body, and each of those tend to be studied independently somewhat.
Can you take us around your shop a little bit? You have a few slides, I know.
Sure. Let me try and share the screen here. Okay, is that coming through okay?
Mm-hmm. It is.
So that's my shop. My wife and I live on the Huron River, about 6 miles out of Ann Arbor, and we have a little pond in front of our house, and so the shop's about 150 feet from the house. It's a delightful commute. Mm-hmm. The great thing about, the bad thing about being out here in the country, more or less, is there's not many violinists around, and the good thing is there's not many violinists around, so there's peace and quiet compared with my friends and colleagues in New York, who are people calling and coming by all the time. For some reason, this is just one slide. Let me go back. Here we go. Mm-hmm. And then I have to go to...
there, okay.
Just a moment. Now, why isn't it? Okay. Okay, there's the shop. There's the upstairs. That's my varnish bench right there. This was taken some years back. The arrangement's a little different now. Downstairs is where I do the woodwork. It's not usually that tidy. I have two full-time assistants, Alex, who's a classically trained violin maker, and Lonnie, who's an artist, but who is an expert at 3D digitizing and running computer-controlled equipment. And so she handles the high-tech side of it. And it's a great team. There's a lot of the violins I make look more or less like old Italian instruments. That's what people seem to order. This is a Guarneri model from some years ago. There's a Stradivari model. There's a scroll. And should I talk a little bit about the process of making them?
Yeah, if you would. Would you back up a little bit and tell me about the wood that you're using? Do you have a place where you store lots and lots of wood? And
yeah, so if I can, okay, yeah. I don't have a picture of the actual storage. It tends to be distributed all over the place. Some in the garden shed, some in the garage, and the ones that I'm closer to using in the shop here. But I'm finding wood and selecting it, and is a huge part of the the process of making an instrument.
so, what varieties of trees do you use? Is it old wood or aged or new?
I don't care so much about that, nor did the old Italians. They used wood that was out of the ground 5 years earlier. They've shown that through scientific analysis. Usually you season. There's also various treatment processes, which I certainly use. You can gently take certain aspects of the wood in the direction of old wood and stabilize it and make it nicer under the varnish. So that's a whole conversation in itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the two basic woods, though, are spruce, traditionally spruce from the Alps, the foothills of the Alps in northern Italy, and then maple would be from ideally from the Yugoslavia, those sort of places. I use a lot of North American wood, especially the top wood. There's Engelmann spruce is a wonderful wood acoustically, so I've probably made more instruments out of that than the European. But there's good wood everywhere. I'm not a big mythologizer of it. They used to say, I think Paganini remarked that Stradivari only used wood from trees on which nightingales sang. That sort of captures the feeling we makers have about wood.
So does it matter if it's alpine spruce or not alpine spruce? Is there something with the growth rate that makes a difference?
Well, the environmental conditions make a difference, but no, it doesn't so much. There's some people who think of it as like, grapes from different regions produce slight differences in the wine, and perhaps that's true for wood, but I haven't found the differences are subtle, and I think they get lost in the making processes. But there are some very important things about wood, how dense it is, especially, and how quickly sound travels through it. And then there's various visual things, how reflective it looks under varnish makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm. So you start with a sketch. I saw the slide you had of the outline of the.
Yes.
Yes. Do you make these yourselves, or do you use? Have you made them off of old instruments? How do you start with the shape?
Well, I started as a new maker. When I started, I really felt that I wanted to draw everything I made and not trace, or I would take the proportions and I would lay it out and hand do it as a good way of, make sure it's filtering through, my brain and learning something. Then after I got together with Greg Alf, we formed Curtin and Alf, we did a lot of copies, sort of museum quality, highly detailed copies of old instruments. And that's a real education. And it's one that, many makers go through. Remember reading about Matisse, and he said he went to the Louvre every day and copied paintings for 10 years. So there's no shame in that at all. But after a while, though, if you're just copying, I find it started to be dispiriting. A, you'll never get exactly like something else, and B, why are you trying to? I began to feel sort of like a Civil War reenactor, you know, where you're fighting battles that have lost and won a long time ago, or a Elvis impersonator or something. But then we get to innovation. That's another side of things. But the design, I very much started as a visually oriented person. My mother's a painter, my father's a photographer, and so I used to do a lot of drawing. And the visual beauty of the violin is what drew me to it. And so the design of the instrument was a big part of it. There's a lot of people looking at ways of recreating it geometrically. It's part of a time period where, you know, perfect circles and harmony of spheres and all these sort of things came into play. But in the end, I think it's what you think is beautiful as an individual maker, and tweaking things that way is for me the satisfying way to go. So you design it, then you somehow get it into a template or cut it into the wood. There's all sorts of methods. And in selecting the wood, though, there's this little tool which measures the speed of sound through the wood, and that turns out to be very helpful. If you measure that and the density of the wood, you know how stiff you know, let's say a top will be for a given weight, or how heavy for a given stiffness is. It's like another tool for measuring that's very much a 20th century thing, if not a 21st century.
So we have a question from someone that relates to this. He wants to know if when you're looking at wood, you're looking for growth rings that are close together, which I guess would be more dense.
Well, for the spruce, typically, you know, something like 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter, 1.5 millimeters for violin. You don't want it too fine visually because it sort of disappears. And if it's too far apart, then it becomes hard to carve the details of the corners because you keep going through hard and soft. Acoustically, it doesn't make a difference. There's sort of a notion that it's the tighter the growth rings, the denser. It's simply not true. For maple, the growth rings, you know, the esteemed wood is sort of old growth wood with very fine growth rings, but, you know, they've cut down most of that, and there's plenty of beautiful wood that the grains are farther apart. So I will use anything that looks acoustically promising and reasonably beautiful, although a lot of the beauty you have to make in the instrument and in the varnishing. So
when you say acoustically promising, what are you looking at to make that?
For the wood?
When you say it looks acoustically promising.
Oh, I want not too heavy, I mean, not too dense, basically. And a lot of the wood one buys from wood dealers, they're not careful to split it, so the grain can be going to one side, and that weakens it and creates all sorts of problems. So to find wood that looks decent, has a good amount, a good density, and a good sort of speed of sound, and that is cut properly, is a continual battle. And I often feel I'm like 5 pieces away from going out of business, but somehow keep finding more, or else I learn more strategies for using wood that is maybe not what I thought it was.
So how, when you are making a violin, how does that differ from the way it was done traditionally by the old makers?
Well, gosh, I would say enormously. Even though we're nominally making the same designs and the same materials. But it's a guess because we don't really have records. They didn't keep shop records, there are not many. We know they hired journeymen to come and do the rough sawing of wood, and they had certainly a lot of assistants. There's a notion of the romantic notion of a violin maker is sort of like Pinocchio's dad, working alone. But the Renaissance shops were big bustling places, and Strad had, 200 years of help just from his sons, and then all the other makers it went through. In that sense, I started off working alone, but eventually came to rely on and greatly benefit from having help. I remember a physicist I know said, "People who get things done get help," and that really sank in. And it's inspiring to have gifted young people around, especially. So in that it's the same, but our conception of what a violin has changed, and our, of course, the technology, the machinery, all of that is we're in a different universe almost. And there's in the violin profession as a whole, I'd say there, for a long time, at least when I was growing up, a sort of a shame associated with using machines. You weren't supposed to use machines. You're supposed to do it by hand. But honestly, I used to say I'll stop using machines when my clients arrive on horseback. It's just, it's a completely arbitrary thing. What is important, I think they get a bad reputation from sort of factory-made instruments where there isn't any individual attention paid to the instruments, and a machine finish is fine for a flat surface, but for a sculpted surface is not really workable. So machines can never do the fine work, or for most of the elements of it. But they're so time consuming. I mean, it saves so much time. And my feeling is, if I'm not either learning from something and I don't love doing it, then there's no reason I need to do it. I get an assistant to do it, and I better still get them to run a machine to do it. It doesn't mean I make a lot more instruments, but I can spend a lot more time. I make my own fittings now, for example, you know, and design them and redesign them. And so just, instead of making one bridge, I'll make, you know, half a dozen. It sort of speeds everything up, and I think in a very good way.
Mm-hmm. So how long does it take from start to finish?
Well, it's hard to say. I make maybe, I used to make 4 to 6 violins a year. I make now with good help, I make maybe 8 or 10. But, you know, probably half of those are experimental ultralights. We can talk about those. So I probably make about 6 traditional instruments a year.
Seems like a very small number. So it is labor intensive.
Oh, yes, yes. But that's the fun part. I just love getting up early in the morning and, you know, turning on a podcast and, you know, doing the woodwork. And that's really, for me now, is the last millimeter or two of the finish. But, you know, whether it's finishing a scroll or a top or a tailpiece even, I just love the finishing process and the final sculpting. And then in the afternoon, I'll do some work on varnish. But of course, running a business and doing a lot of research, you know, it's, my time is divided many ways. So the main thing is to stay efficient.
Mm-hmm. So we have somebody who just asked whether you make cellos and violas as well.
I make violas quite a lot. My first instrument was a viola. I made one cello, but I don't play the cello at all. So it felt sort of like adjusting it. I have to work with a player, and it'd be like working with it by remote control. And I haven't made another one, though I constantly think about it. And I'm thinking I'll have a cello year and maybe take some cello lessons. And I certainly have some beautiful cello wood, and I have some ideas about making cellos, which I'd like to get to. But so far, mostly violins, because that's most people come looking for violins. But I'd say I make maybe a quarter of my output is violas, or a bit less.
About a quarter of violas?
Yeah, a quarter of violas or an eighth, maybe. I don't know. It varies year to year. In the last couple of years, I've actually ended up making quite a few.
So we have another question. It's, when you think of yourself, do you think of yourself primarily as a scientist, an artist? Let's see if I can get the exact wording here. A physicist, an engineer, a musician, or an artist?
Well, the wonderful thing about violin making is that I've had a lot of passionate interests at different times of my life. As my earliest, as a child, was like trying to make things, you know, airplanes, or, you know, anything mechanical, and drawing and design. I also spent, you know, time in you know, drawing in the art side, and I fell in love with violin when I was a teenager, just crazy about it. But also as a child, I'd been very interested in science, but I put that aside. But violin making, it suddenly, I could play in all these sandboxes and still it would be a job. I couldn't pass a first year physics exam, or even a high school one. I don't have any math. So I've been able to work in the science of the violin just by the mentorship of physicists and engineers and people. And one of the things I love doing is trying to translate these, physics or science concepts into sort of workshop English so I can understand them. But I absolutely love writing and doing a lot of that. So I just, one of my heroes was Leonardo, and he didn't really distinguish between art and science. They're both ways of interacting with the world. And I just feel that way. They're both super interesting. I would die if I had to give up either one. I mean, you do science for too long, I feel, it can be kind of arid from a certain point of view. And then the arts, I mean, have their own tortures. If you're, there's no objective answers, so it's a blessing for me, at least, to be able to flip from one to the other. So that's probably a longer answer than you wanted, but that's
it. So the same questioner followed up with, in what ways do you use math when you're producing an instrument? You do use math quite a lot.
No, not at all. I barely do arithmetic. But this is to say, I mean, I feel guilty for not learning math and doing experimental stuff, and you need it. And I remember asking my physicist mentor, Gabriel Weinreich, so should I go back to school and learn math? He said, well, you could do that, or you could just find a mathematician. And that's really it. It's such a teamwork. So for papers like our blind test, we had a statistician on board because I wouldn't have a clue what to do otherwise. But I think I understand a lot of the concepts of physics as it relates to acoustics and vibration. I don't pretend to be naive in that way at all. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. I just don't happen to be able to speak mathematics, which is really the native language of physics. So it's a strange situation to be in, but so it is. I'll be honest. I just, math terrifies me. I'm a little dyslexic with numbers, I think, which to start with.
So you make instruments on order from specific musicians on occasion. Is that right? What proportion of your instruments do you just make and then sell versus those that you make specifically for someone?
Oh, they're mostly all on commission. I've had more time during this pandemic, of course. Sadly, a lot of people have to drop out of the market. So I've done more on, instruments I wanted to make. But I space out my commissions so that I have time to do the things I like. I really need that space.
Do they ask for specific things like, can you make one with certain tonal qualities? Can you set out to do that?
Yes, I think you learn more and more how to control the darkness, the brightness, the amount of overall sound. But honestly, I think every maker has their voice in the same way that a writer has his or her voice, or there's just a collection of habits and ways of thinking that tend to lead to a certain kind of sound. You can vary that somewhat, but for example, I've always liked powerful instruments, and it's been a shock to realize that some people really don't, and they don't like a lot of high frequencies under their ear. And I sort of asked, well, why do you play the violin then? But they do, and they can play incredibly well sometimes. So I've learned, especially through these blind tests, about how various people's tastes are. And so for my part, I've tried to learn, where the different sort of acoustical knobs are to be able to shape the sound one way or the other. And that's a fascinating topic in itself.
So when you finish one on commission and a person plays it, do they come back to you and say, I'd like a little more of this or a little more of that? Do you then modify it, or?
Absolutely. It's more the violin changes over, the first few years, especially the wood settles in, just sort of that's more maintenance. But I like to, I miss it when instruments disappear and I never hear how they're doing. I'd rather have people saying, oh, I love this, but can this be changed a little? Because it's really the interaction between good musicians, especially, and makers that helps so much. There's some makers who just send their instruments off to dealers, and that's fine too. But I think it'd be harder to to really learn, you know, the ins and outs of the subtleties of tone production that, you know, the different players have.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, we've got 5 questions, 7 questions came in just in that.
should I turn off the screen, or what should I do?
No, it's okay. I'll
Okay,
look. There's a good one. What causes wolf whistles or sounds?
The wolf tone is actually a well understood aspect of violin acoustics. It's when there's a strong resonance in the body, the bridge moves too much to be a stable support for the string. So if you imagine imagine a skipping rope tied to a wall, and you could create a standing wave and it would bounce off the wall, and that would be hard. But now imagine doing the same thing off a fishing pole or something. It's moving too, and you get this confusion. Now, if the bridge didn't move at all, the violin wouldn't make any sound. So it has to be moving, but there's some frequencies, typically C or C sharp on a violin, where there's a massive resonance of the body, and that creates an instability. And it's actually easy to avoid in principle. You need to take that resonance and split it by coupling another resonance to it, and that makes 2 smaller ones. And that's how wolf eliminators work, basically.
Mm-hmm. There are a couple of funny questions. One wants to know if you ever have dropped a violin during the process of making or repairing.
Oh gosh, I tended to drop things. Yes, I've not too often. I worry because I do things, but I think I learn to be just quite careful after you do it a few times. But you know, things do get damaged. But the thought of violin is it's especially one that isn't finished yet. If you crack a top somehow, you can make another one. You know, it's not like someone else's $1 million instrument, then your career is over. Wood is way. If it can't be repaired, it can be replaced.
They're not as delicate as they appear. I remember when my kids began to play at 3 years old, I thought, should a 3-year-old actually have one of these? And it turns out that, you know, they're not as delicate as one would imagine.
Yeah, it's remarkable that, and I'm one of my interests in innovation is making them even more durable. There's no reason they have to be quite as fragile as they are in some ways.
Mm-hmm. That same questioner asked if you've made a left-handed violin. A violin with the chin rest on the other side.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Have you ever made a left-handed violin? They are left-handed. Have you ever made a right-handed violin?
No, I haven't, and it puzzles me actually why a left-handed person would not play it the same way as anyone else, because you have to do hard things with both hands. I'm not sure. In fact, if you had to ask me if I'm right-handed, which would I do the finger with, I would instinctively say the right hand. So, but is that person who's asking left-handed, and why did they feel they needed one that was set up the other way?
Yeah, I don't know. We can ask at the end. The problem, of course, is all the violinists point the same way. If you have one going the other way in an orchestra, it's disruptive. You'd have to put them on the outside.
Yes, it is. I think you see that more with you know, bluegrass and folk violin, where no one's worried about the things we worry about in orchestras. You know, the symmetries and conformities.
Okay, I want to move on just a little bit. I'd like to know about your experiments, and more importantly, I would like to know how the experiments that you've done have affected your own instrument making.
Well, that's that breaks down into a million other questions. Let me flip through the slides with bits of violins.
You can stop at any of those slides if you like to.
Well, we can come back to the last question. So I got interested in the science of the violin when I met Caroline Hutchins, who was an early researcher who was very influential in bringing people into the field. And she's a very charismatic person. And it sort of reawakened my early interest in science. And then in Ann Arbor, when I moved here in the mid 80s, I met Gabriel Weinreich, who is really a top-notch physicist who was studying violin. And he was studying, one of the things was how sound radiates from violins and how to measure it. And so over the years, I eventually started designing and building equipment for measuring the sound of violin. And this is a sort of rig I've come up with, which is now used by quite a few makers and researchers in one form or the other. And there's this little hammer there. Does the cursor come through? You can. So there's this little hammer there that taps the bridge, and that sets everything into vibration, and then a microphone that picks up the sound. And let me see. Yeah, there's the hammer. It's called an impulse hammer. And inside it, there's a little sensor, so it knows exactly how hard it hits and the frequency content of the tap. So by comparing that to the microphone, you can, it doesn't matter how hard you hit it, you can tell what the violin is doing. And it's and you want to measure from different directions, so you can rotate the violin around, because the violin radiates different frequencies in different directions at higher frequencies. And what you do with that is you make a graph of how much energy is at each frequency. It's called a spectrum. And this looks like a bunch of, jagged lines, but after working with it a lot, it becomes a very familiar landscape, and you recognize small changes and ongoing features. And I've measured now hundreds of violins and done a lot of work with this. And so the reason for measuring it is you can tell, if you're trying to copy an instrument, do you get the same measurements? And B, if you do something, if you adjust the sound post, does anything change? It's easy to convince yourself that you're hearing a change or that your client is hearing a change. If you can hear it, you can measure it for a lot of the stuff. There's some complications to that, but so it's kind of like if you're flying an airliner, you can do it by eye, but it's sure good to have instrumentation if the weather's bad. That's how I feel with having measure equipment. I use it all the time for when I'm adjusting my instruments, as well as when I'm doing more pure research. So one of the kind of the holy grail of violin making is to find objective violins for objective parameters for violin quality. What's the difference between a good violin and a bad violin in objective terms? So that you need to do some sort of an objective measurement, and I measure the sound radiation. And the other half is you've got to find out, what do players think is a good violin? It used to be taken for granted. Oh, if it's old Italian, it's good. And how do you find out if it's good? You give it to a player and ask them, and they play it and they say, yes, it is or isn't. But it turns out to be quite a challenge to get people violins that everyone agrees are good. And we can talk more about that later. But that's one of the things that drew me into measuring, to try and find a measurement for quality or for the various playing qualities of the violin. Yeah. And so go ahead. But it's affected my making at every level. I think when you start as a maker, you have sort of a mental model of how it works, and it tends to be kind of a simplified one, and these intuitive feelings about what creates what. But I found that almost all my intuitive sense of how violin worked was dead wrong as soon as I got into the physics and the science of it. And the more of it I understand, the more it clarifies to me why we do the things to do, and also the limits of what can be done, but also the degrees of freedom there are within those limits. So it's sort of a lifelong study, but an endlessly interesting one, I think.
Looking at this chart you have here and showing the objective measurements, are those all from the same instrument? I mean, how close are two instruments with that profile?
This one, this is a single instrument.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a bunch of instruments. I think those are all the instruments in the Paris experiment overlaid on each other. And looking at one instrument is nice, but if you look at a lot of them and then take averages, you start to see what are the things violins have in common, and how much do they change from one to the next.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those instruments were very old and some were new instruments, and they all plot similarly on this.
Yes, that's the thing. The notion I grew up with, and indeed the violin world has been under the spell of, is that old instruments are distinctly different. There's something that players recognize immediately, and that, I mean, a Strad is the very definition of quality, you know. But when you start looking at measurements, you got to scratch your head. Well, it's different, but are the differences significant? Are there differences I can hear? Is the difference between any two Strads more than between any two new violins? And it turns out, I mean, when we get to the blind test, there aren't characteristics of old instruments. I think it's a sort of a lazy way of describing sound as old or new, because players can't hear that and audiences can't hear that. They hear a lot of things, but it's not old or new.
Mm-hmm. So would you show us, would you go back to the slide where you show the interior of a violin, and let's look at some of those. There we go. Yeah. Uh-huh. There was one even earlier, I think. There we go. Can you take us through these and show us what these are?
Yeah, these are the parts of the violin: the top, the back, the sides, and the scroll and fingerboard. And then, of course, there's the fittings, the pegs, the sound post, the tailpiece. And then
the next one, the bar that goes vertically. What is the function of that?
That's the bass bar, and that's got a number of functions. One is to support the downward force of the strings, at least on one side, and the sound post supports it on the other. Otherwise, it would, you know, slowly collapse. But more importantly, it takes a symmetrical shape and makes it asymmetric acoustically, and that's very important. It's often the case that if you have a symmetrical thing, it's doing this, the two sides balance out, and you have air, I mean, or pressure waves just sloshing between them. Whereas if you have one side doing a lot more, then you have sort of a net change in volume, and that turns out to be what causes sound radiation at low frequencies. And the bass bar is extremely important in that way. There were early instruments that had that didn't have that. There's viols that didn't have sound posts, for example, and they'd have you know, a bass bar in the center. So we do know that they can be functioning and lovely instruments, but they don't do the sort of things that we want a violin to do. Mm-hmm.
And then the next slide you have shows the sound post.
Yes, and that's the sound post connects the top and the back, and is just behind the treble bridge foot, and it's of course a very sensitive thing. You adjust that with some of the tools. You stick the little prongs in there and mirror and see where it is, and you can. And with a lot of instruments, an adjustment of you know, even a 1/10 of a millimeter can make a surprising difference. Some instruments they're not very sensitive, but the length of it, the exact place is one of the main arenas of adjustment for the violin maker and the player. Now this instrument, by the way, was one I got sick and tired of. It just wasn't working, so I cut it in half. I don't really believe the stories of Strad destroying the instruments he didn't like, but sometimes, you know, this is around for ages. I thought, well, if I'm going to cut it in half, might as well do it in a useful way where I can show people the inside. So that's how that came into being, out of a lot of frustration, actually.
So I remember being surprised that the sound post is not glued in place. It's just held there. It just fits in there, and can be knocked and moved around.
Yeah, and it's a source of frustration too, because it can get, if the instrument gets bumped, it can jog and you don't know anything's happened, but suddenly it's a different instrument. You know, it can really, or fall over. You know, things like that make the instrument a very frustrating one often.
So something like a banjo or a guitar, they lack this sound post. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. That's right. They have internal bracing, and so it's as though they have a number of bass bars going in different directions, but they don't have sound posts.
Is this one of the reasons the violin is much louder than a guitar, an acoustic? Well,
it's an interesting question. Instruments, if you like, have different strategies for getting attention. You have percussion ones where you make a lot of sound quickly, and that grabs the ear, and then you have the voice, which puts out a lot of sound continually, and you have ones in between, like the piano and the guitar, where there's a a strong beginning and then it dies away. Now for instruments like that, it happens you don't need a high bridge because you want the instrument, you want the energy to stay in the strings so that it rings for a long time. Where with a violin, you're putting out sound continuously. You want the sound to go through the bridge and get out there. So you have this high bridge, which acts as a stronger lever, so you can get a lot more energy out of the strings quickly. And so it's sort of the whole drivetrain of the violin, the bridge through the sound post and the bass bar on the other side. And that's so much of violin making is getting those right.
Mm-hmm.
And go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that the other thing I think is interesting is that the violin is not, it's glued with water soluble glue, so it can be steamed. And
yes, it's
yeah,
glued with hide glue, and the reason for that is hide glue is easy to reverse. You can loosen it, sometimes just by tapping the side, it'll break. It's brittle. It doesn't. Whereas some of the artificial glues are a bit more flexible and very permanent, and so you can't get them apart without destroying the instrument. One of the real geniuses of violin design is that it can be taken apart, and so it can be repaired. Whereas guitars, with their binding around the edges, they're more or less permanently shut, and so people tend to get new guitars every 5 or 10 years. It's extraordinary. There's no reason in principle they couldn't be repaired or rebarred or regraduated, anything that you can do to a violin, but it's just not part of that culture.
mm-hmm.
So yes, having not just hide glue, but hide glue of the right consistency. It's quite weak for the top, so you can take the top off easily without damaging it. A bit stronger. If for the joints in the back are things that need to be permanent, you want a stronger glue. There's another glue that was used historically called casein, which is made from milk, milk protein, and that's a very strong glue. And I use that for jointing the backs and things that need to really stay stuck together.
Does it also protect against cracks to have places where it could fail and do no harm, like the seam?
Yeah, very good point. Yes, exactly why we want the not glued together too tightly, because with the the expansion and contraction due to humidity, especially with big instruments like cellos and basses, they just would tear themselves apart if they're too tightly glued together. So that's a very good point. It's sort of a safety valve, and so much damage is done through bad repairs. People who use wrong glues, and then it really makes it difficult to put things right again.
Let's see. Let's go on through your slides and see if there are things that we missed along the way that are important. Yeah. There you show the bridge.
Oh yeah, the bridge. Yeah, the bridge I think is the single most important acoustical element in terms of what can be adjusted. And you can done a lot of experimenting with this, and there's good research on it. In particular, if you look at the bridge there on the right, there's sort of a waist. There's those two sort of kidney-shaped holes, and the width of that waist in relation to the mass above it makes a particular resonance, and that's one of the very important ones, because the strings are filtered through that before getting to the body. So you can, when you lower the strings, for example, you lower the bridge because the neck has sunk a little bit, then suddenly there's less mass on the top, and that resonance goes up in frequency, and it changes the instrument. Sometimes subtly, sometimes a lot. You can actually take a fraction of or you can take a millimeter of wood from the waist, and it'll make a big difference to the sound. It's really quite extraordinarily sensitive.
When you take a millimeter from the waist of the bridge itself, not of the instrument. Yeah, we have a question about, why is the bridge not perfectly symmetrical?
A good question. Well, because for the ergonomics are such that the players on the E string, which is a lot higher tension, they want it closer to the fingerboard than the G string. So that explains about 2 millimeters of difference. And often makers will tend to rotate the neck a little bit so that people's playing angle is a little bit lower. So that again explains some of it.
And the follow-up question is it often challenging to make an instrument that has equally strong E and G strings, for instance?
Oh yes, it's. I guess I don't. I only work with my own instruments, so that kind of unevenness isn't something that I usually have to struggle with. But I know with looking at instruments in a broader sense, yes, that can be a real challenge. Exactly why it is so, I don't know. It may differ for each instrument somewhat, but it's really a lot to do with the balance of the high frequency output and the low frequency output. And also, if you can imagine that jagged mountain range that was a spectrum, if there are sort of holes in it, areas where there isn't any sound radiating in this valley, then the player coming across is going to have a very uneven experience versus a frequency response that is more even across. You're not going to fall into these holes and have to adjust with your playing every change, with the sound changing every note. I didn't say that very eloquently, but I hope.
But you got the idea across. The bridge and the sound post. What sorts of wood do you use? Is it all one, or is it different?
The bridge is maple, and we don't, not curly maple. You don't want to figure, you want to. This is all structural, so it's usually a fine grained maple, and the sound post is spruce, like the top. Now the sound post is in a way a lot simpler. There's only two things that are important about it, really: that it fits the top and the back and is the right length, and the other that it's not too heavy. So the weight and the fit. So it's really quite a simple thing. You can replace sound posts and you're not particularly worried if you get the length and the fit right. The bridge, though, the kind of wood, the density, the mass of it, all of that makes a difference. So it's a more complex thing. But then again, the complexities sound post has to do with the subtleties of adjusting the position. So that's where, and it's easier to do that than to change the bridge. So and focus a lot on the post for routine adjustments.
Let's see. Let's go through your slides some more, and let's get to some where you're showing experiments.
Varnishing is a big area of interest and there's a lot of mythology about Stradivari's varnish, for example, and it was made of, and it was one of the big sort of cultural mysteries, the old Italian varnish, and rather like the Oriental lacquer for centuries, people were trying to figure out what made this amazing substance. Well, it turned out that Oriental lacquer was simple stuff of a particular bush, and it turns out that old Italian varnish is just varnish. It's oil and tree resin, but it's how it aged and how it's used. And I mean, just because you have the same paints that Rembrandt used doesn't necessarily mean you can paint a Rembrandt. There's an element of that in it, but it's often varnishing the violin is the most terrifying part, because you can, especially when you're a young maker, you can completely ruin the look of it by, the wrong varnish. And I probably stripped more varnish for many years than I applied. I mean, I would put on several times trying to get it right. But one of the things we've had in the last 20, 30 years has been ever increasing analysis of, the old Italian varnishes. And there's, gorgeous images. And in this, you can see like the top one on the left, there's a little particle of pigment in a clear film. And the one beside it, there's the layers going into the wood. There's different layers of varnish and colors. And the one below I love with the sparkles. That's with it's fluorescing with different UV light, different things in it, different particles. And we did this. Well, then the next thing I have is to do with the blind tests. And should I talk about those a little?
Well, I have a follow-up on the varnish question. I have seen instruments that were unvarnished. And I've also seen instruments that have a soft varnish that's sort of rubbed on, that might even rub off on you. So the varnish is important. An unvarnished instrument, how does it differ in sound from one that is varnished?
Well, I don't know. Maybe often makers feel it sounds best when it's unvarnished, and there's certainly an acoustical reason. The varnish would probably tend to damp the sound a little. And one argument is that you might need a bit of damping, but you can ruin an instrument by putting a sort of a soft, thick varnish on it. It's just absorbing too much energy. But it also has a protective function. If you have plain wood, it's just going to get dirty. And what varnish one might think it does is slow down the passage of humidity into the instrument. It doesn't. I mean, it'll stop droplets of water from going in, but actually water vapor passes through it rather readily, which is why humidity affects instruments. Now, in principle, these days we could put a completely vapor-proof varnish on. I mean, there's polymers that do that. I mean, look at what your cheese puffs come in, or your, there's things that'll stay fresh for years because they don't let vapors through. We could use, if that were used on a violin, I think it would solve a lot of the problems players have. But that's not what old Italian varnish did. What old Italian varnish did was look red or orange or golden when it was new and give a sense of value to it. And also by the color tends to unify the instrument rather than having different kinds of wood sort of all thrown together. It brings it all together in a lovely way. And the other thing about the varnish is that it ages gracefully, especially the old stuff. The way it flaked off and wore off, it has very charming effects. And you see copies made by, let's say, French makers in the 1800s, which much harder varnish. And I'm not worried about the sound, but it doesn't age quite as gracefully. So there's been an interest in recapturing the sort of Italian varnishes and the way they age.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, we have a couple of questions that I want to look at. Oh, right. How do you deal with the effects of humidity on the instruments? So do you have a humidifier running all the time in your shop? Do you?
Oh, I have air conditioning, so it keeps it drier in the summer than it would be, and I have a humidifier in the central heating, like most people. So it's not a big problem. And it used to be that when I was young, that it was sort of the norm for players to have a summer and winter setup. But I think that air conditioning is so universal now. Players, orchestras, soloists, they're going from hotel to hotel, not from taking a coach across the countryside. But that said, I might have one player for the summer is going to Maine to play in a chamber music festival where it's incredibly humid, and others going down to Aspen where it's incredibly dry. So you do have these drastic changes. I had a violin and a concertmaster in an orchestra in South America. It was incredibly humid, and I got the instrument back for adjustments, and it was just collapsing on itself. And so the answer is there is no easy way other than developing a kind of a coating that protects against it. It's just something players and makers have to live with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on to your experiments now.
Okay. Oh, wrong way. I'm sorry. Okay, so this is Claudia Fritz. She was a French scientist. I met her at Cambridge University, where she was doing a postdoc in how to evaluate or how players perceive instruments and how they evaluate them. And we got to talking, and we invited her to Oberlin, which we have an acoustics workshop for violin makers there and researchers. And she's started running some little blind tests there where, blind tests are the fundamental tool for getting objective data from subjective experiences. You can't just ask people because the answer isn't what isn't objective at all. But if you in the case of sound, if you blindfold people so they don't know what instrument they're playing, you can get in some ways, a more honest set of answers. And I never really paid much attention until I sat down blindfolded with a set of 10 instruments, and she said, okay, now rate them from what you think is best to worst. And suddenly with these goggles on, it was completely, in one way, liberating, because you didn't have to be polite about the individual instruments, and disorienting in another way. But it was actually quite life-changing, because I think every violinist needs to try it, because we get so caught up in our, impassioned feelings about the instrument, which we should do, as artists. You want that emotional engagement, but there's also times where you want to be able to step back and say, especially when you're shopping for an instrument, where you don't want to be swayed by how much it costs or how pretty it looks necessarily. So Claudia created something of a paradigm shift in the field by bringing this in, and we started doing blind tests. And of course, people have been doing blind tests for centuries. The first blind tests were done back in Paris in the late 1700s. But they've mostly been used for either, to sell instruments, by comparing them, or informal demonstrations. But by the 20th century, blind testing became absolutely ubiquitous for, pharmaceutical testing. It's just absolutely needed, but for cultural reasons, it never made it to the violin world. And there's a big resistance to it, and all sorts of stories made up why it wouldn't work. But then you try it, and it does in fact work. And so I got excited about it, and I said, let's try and do an experiment, and with old violins and new violins, and can people tell the difference? And I got a message from Glenn Kwok, who organizes the Indianapolis International Competition, saying, do we want to do an experiment there? And so we jumped on it, and we managed to get together 3 old Italians, a Strad, 2 Strads and a Del Gesù, and then we got 3 new instruments, and then a hotel room, and we got a bunch of players to come in and sort, their preferences. And it was actually, it was astonishing for me. It's one thing to hear that, players can or can't tell the difference, and it's another to be in a room, albeit a darkened one, and hear players, fantastic players, pick up a Strad and mutter about, this is a cheap this or that, or conversely pick up a new one. This is a great Guarneri. And of course they wouldn't all say the same thing about the same instruments, but I realized that their experiences of the instrument were profoundly unexpected to me, and that sort of radicalized me. And I said, okay, I don't believe what anyone says now. I'm just gonna try and do more experiments. So the results for that were, we found that the most preferred instrument was new, the least preferred was a Strad. But more importantly, people couldn't tell the difference. It was like a coin toss. Statistically, there was just no significant, people couldn't tell better than random whether instrument was old or new. And these were instruments, the new ones, that had been finished between I think a year or two and a couple of weeks, and so that truly shocked me. And we published it, and it made a big stir, and we were roundly criticized for a lot of things. I remember a famous violinist said, you testing a Strad in a hotel room is like testing a Ferrari in a parking lot. It was a good epithet, but not entirely fair. In fact, most violinists are very familiar with hotel rooms and do a lot of practicing, and the one we've used is actually quite big and quite good for testing instruments. You don't want a very live room for testing instruments. So some of them were unfair, but still the point was valid. We only had a very small sample size of instruments. And so about a year or so later, Claudia got a call from a French violinist who was criticizing the experiment, and along the similar lines. And, how did we get, we didn't have the good old ones, and we tweaked the new ones, you name it, all the things that we could have done. But unlike others, he offered to help design a better one. And so we jumped at this. He had connections with violin dealers and could help organize getting really good old instruments together. So Claudia spent an enormous amount of time setting this, what we call now the Paris experiment, where we managed to get 10 soloists to come. And being in Paris, that was helpful. Do you want to come for a week to Paris? Sure. And we ended up having an astonishing assortment of old violins, maybe 19 of them, and there were a total of 6 or 7 Strads, and I think two Del Jesus and a bunch of other, and we had about 20 or 30 new instruments. And people say, how did we find them? Well, basically, you just put out the notice we wanted these instruments, and they sort of filtered in. And then we had a series of informal blind tests for each of them to find the best, what we thought were the best 6 new and the best 6 old. And that was very carefully controlled. And then we had the players, their job was to choose a violin to replace your own for an upcoming concert tour. You have to give something specific. Do you want a violin you want to buy for the rest of your life? Well, that's a complicated one, but which of these would suit you for an upcoming concert tour? And so they spent an hour with the instrument and they picked the one they liked, and then they could, the next day they did it in a hall. They could play with the piano. They could have a friend listen. They could do everything they would do to test a violin except see what it was, because they were wearing these goggles all the time. And let me see. And then we brought an orchestra in and had, a couple of soloists, A, B, the violins for an audience to see which ones projected better, or which ones were old and which were new. And as with the Indianapolis experiment, the most preferred violin easily was new. The least preferred happened to be a Strad, but all of the old ones were Strads except for one. So generally the new instruments were preferred, although the second most chosen instrument was a Strad. So and then neither players nor listeners could tell better than a coin toss whether it was old or new. So to me, the old sound, new sound, I don't think it exists. It's just kind of I think of a lazy way of describing a sound. Mm-hmm. And then we did another one in, with the audience, they couldn't tell. And then we did the same thing in the Grand Hall in Cooper Union. That's where Abraham Lincoln gave a famous speech. But this was, there's a Japanese television came in, and so they set up this great light box where the violinists could be seen in silhouette playing. And we had about 50 experienced listeners, and we had 3 new and 3 by Stradivari, and we did ABA comparisons. And as with in Paris, the new instruments projected better than the old instrument. There's a myth about old instruments, especially Strads, that they're quiet under the ear, but in a hall they get bigger and they outproject loud new instruments, which are loud close up, and then they sort of fade away, which kind of violates physics. So it wasn't clear to us how it was possible. And we spent a long time trying to find a mellow old instrument that projected well, and we haven't been able to. It seems that essentially louder instruments make more noise and they project better. And this experiment tended to confirm that. We've done one since that go into more detail, but we divided the audience and asked one half which violin you prefer and the other which projects better. And it turns out that there's a strong relation between projection and preference. So that makes sense. People like what they can hear better. In general, like with a piano, you're not worried about how loud it is, or with a well-trained voice, you're not. But with the violin, it's a small instrument. It doesn't produce a lot of sound. So projection is a real issue. And age certainly does not guarantee projection. And if anything, I think new violins definitely have the advantage there. And those are all slides. So should I stop sharing, Trine, or just we can flip back and forth?
You can stop sharing the slides for a moment. I had two questions about this. Sometimes you hear violinists say, well, I play a Strad better because it feels better in my hands. And once you learn how to play it, it really gives you back more. And it has to do with this emotional or tactile attachment they have. Can you speak to that a little?
Yes, I think it's absolutely real. If someone gave me a violin, and this violin was built by Stradivari, and it was played by Heifetz. I mean, you just treat it with reverence, and that's natural. That's part of being human. There's nothing very mysterious about it, versus something that was finished last year. Okay, it's lovely, but it's just that's how we are as humans. And the audience, if it's some anonymous violin or it's this violin with this huge history, I mean, it speaks to us. It's senseless to argue with that. But let's compare it with other fields, such as, well, classic cars. I remember there was a Ferrari, you know, that's kind of a brand name like Strad, but, you know, I remember the time they were trying to sell a Stradivari viola in auction for something like 18 million, or was it 30 million, something outrageously high at the time. But the same, and it failed, it didn't sell. About that time, they had a 1964 Ferrari GTO, and it sold for 34 million, and that was considered underpriced. And it shows, I mean, that instrument had a provenance. It was sold to a French race driver who crashed it. It was rebuilt and then ended up with a rock star, you know, and so it had this story that was very appealing, just like the Strads do. But the difference is that people would absolutely esteem this beautiful object, this car, for its history and for its design, beauty, and everything else. But they would never put it in a race with a new one, because there's been progress made. I mean, that's just natural. You wouldn't confuse the two. You couldn't win a Formula One race with a car that was built last year, let alone, you know, it's just because things are moving so quickly. I think there's a real element of that in the violin world, especially now when there's such a blossoming of good makers. And we know so much about the acoustics and what the old guys were doing and centuries of experience. All of the old violins have been completely re-engineered. They're not, if you took a violin off of Stradivari's workbench with a bow from the time, you couldn't play the, you know, the standard repertoire. And if you did, you probably wouldn't be heard very well. So always say the actual physical performing things is one thing that's quite separate from the story, and both are important, and how much importance you put on them depends on who you are and what your interests are, and what your marketing needs are. So we can't quarrel with that, and I never would. I'm as bewitched by the beauty of old instruments as anyone. I spent decades of my life trying to, you know, bathing in it and trying to learn it and then analyze it and copy it, and I still love it. But one can also be a little more precise as a you know, a professional in describing the playing qualities of an instrument. And I think of violinists aren't really trained to hear tone quality objectively the way, let's say, a recording engineer is. If you're a recording engineer and you hear a squeal, you know what the frequency is, because you have to be able to get in there and tune it out. And there's, you know, ear training courses you have for it. So violinists will tend to use, you know, metaphors or images. It's dark, it's bright, it's honky, it's goosey, whatever, and try and get the feeling across. But there isn't any reason, I think, that makers and players shouldn't train more objectively. After all, if a musician looks at the score, that's objective. You know, they can say it gets sad here or something, or they can just say it turns to the minor key. You know, that would be more appropriate. And I have a kind of a similar professional feel about violin sound. Okay, we can bathe in the beauty of it and describe it in poetic terms, or we can actually roll up our sleeves and try and figure out what's going on and try and describe it in non-metaphorical terms. And that is useful, I think, if you're trying to make better violins or if you're trying to choose a violin. So it doesn't mean we have to give up the other side at all. You can, the two aren't at odds with each other at all, to my mind. I don't know what your question was now, but.
No, that was good. That was good. So we have a question from one of the listeners. How do you re-engineer an old instrument?
Well, let's imagine you had an instrument that you just discovered, an instrument that, you know, was built in the early 1700s. Let's say you had one from Strad's shop and you wanted to play a concert on it next year. Now, you would never do this because it would be considered sacrilegious now to touch it. It would be a historical object. But in fact, over the period of time, they indeed did touch it. The first thing they did was put longer fingerboards on because people wanted to play higher and higher. You know, Paganini wanted to play higher, so he was one of the forces driving longer fingerboards and then longer necks. And then the strings changed profoundly. That changed the setup of the instrument and the sound we get. So we started lengthening the bass bar. Often these instruments were regraduated, so they'd thin out the top if they were left on the thick side. A completely different bridge with very different acoustic properties. And then not to mention all the repairs over the centuries, repairs and re-repairs. And if the archings get distorted, they will bring them back. I mean, with instruments that are that valuable, you throw a lot of money. You throw, you know, 10,000, 100,000 to bring these things into shape. And these are not subtle changes. These are very large changes.
It could change the sound entirely, I suppose.
Well, sure, absolutely.
Oh, here's a question. Have you ever made a piccolo violin?
I haven't. There's a charm in small ones. No, I haven't. I sometimes think about that because there's so many incredibly talented young players, but there aren't good instruments out, and it seems some of the acoustics could help, you know, help get a little better sound from smaller instruments, even if they didn't look entirely traditional. I mean, I think that'd be a valid case for, you know, stretching the classical look a little in order to give these young players something more resembling a full-size sound.
So I have one last question, and then we'll open it up. Maybe Julia will help me turn on people's videos and unmute them so they can ask questions in person. But often you hear from someone who has a brand new instrument, oh, it still has to open out. It will take time for it to open out, and they're generally meaning to make it sound more louder, maybe, or more I don't know, more harmonics. But is this fake or is this real? And what happens in the early, I don't know, the first year to 3 years of an instrument's life?
Well, I hear that sound and I don't know what it means. I mean, I'm not being facetious. I get that. To me, it means they're not happy with what it is now, and they're being polite. It will open up. But I would never sell a violin saying it's a little tight now or whatever now, but it'll open up any more than, you know, if someone sold me a computer and it didn't work and they said, well, you know, work it a while, you know, I don't think that happens. I think a new violin does change a lot over the first year, and, you know, as the forces settle out, the wood settles. But you should, I mean, you can get a new violin sounding absolutely fantastic. And I say this not I say this from having seen 1-week-old violins, 2-week-old violins in the hands of soloists in a blind test, saying it's a golden period Strat and a great one. Mm-hmm. And then they'll pick up a golden period Strat and say, well, this will open up. You know, it doesn't. It's an image. It's a hope. It's an aspiration. There isn't any clear process where it sounds immature and it gradually gets more refined. It's changing all the time, and we nudge it in the direction that players want it to be in. Mm-hmm. So in my opinion.
Uh-huh. So it's sort of a wives' tale.
Yeah. Well, yeah. A lot of these are based on, you know, they've got some truth in them, and I think there've been an awful lot of bad violins made for a long time. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are a lot of violins that were made just too thick, and they were, you know, they sounded, you know, shrill and shallow and all the things we think of as a new violin. And then there's this hope, well, play it for a while and mellow out, because here's these other violins and they're mellow and they're old, but actually they were thinned out, or they were, you know, it's these changes I don't think happen just through goodwill and playing and time. Nothing happens that way. I think everything happens because physical changes, acoustical changes happen to the violin, either because the materials change, which we've never been able to establish, or the shape changes a little, which certainly happens. or the adjustment changes, which happen all the time, or the humidity changes, which happens all the time. So there's a lot of things going on. But with these complex systems, it's so inviting to, project onto them. When we play them, we don't, remember a famous restorer and adjuster, Rene Morel, he said, people say this instrument is tight. What it means is they feel tight. It makes them feel tight. You know what I mean? We're interacting with this thing. So a lot of the ways we describe the instrument are really descriptions of the reaction of us and the violin together. So all these sort of descriptions, need to be taken seriously if you're working with players and if you're doing research, because this is evidence. But what does it mean, and should it be taken literally? That's something else. So I don't like to dismiss things as wives' tales, but I think that usually the situation is more complicated, more interesting than the simple explanations we often get.
So we have two questions. One is, do you make bows? Violin makers sometimes make only violins. Do you make bows also?
I have a few colleagues who do both, but I only make violins and violins and violas. I'm fascinated by bows. I'm fairly ignorant of them, but I'm sometimes tempted to learn them. But that's a whole other world, really, and it's another chunk of my life, and I don't have so many chunks left to diversify like that.
Another question is, and I know the answer to this one. Do you have the names of people who are playing your instrument? And you have some listed on your website.
Yeah. I have, on my website, there's a lot of names. I've been lucky to have some famous players like Yehudi Menuhin and Ruggiero Ricci but I won't make a list. But
it's lucky if you get someone like Yehudi Menuhin to play your instruments and to like them.
Yes, it is. Being the getting an instrument in good hands is a real joy, and I'm so in awe of what good players do. As myself a failed violinist, I really, what people do with their bare hands on stage in front of people, to me, is amazing.
Breathtaking, really.
Yeah, and I'm still just riveted by the sound of good violin playing.
Likewise. So in the chat, if you are listening, Julia put a link there. You can see the list, a list of some people who play your instruments. And also, I forgot to mention that if you haven't already been to our website, we have a YouTube clip of the Paris double-blind, a documentary that was done about the Paris double-blind study, and you can watch that. We forgot to look at the slides that you had of your ultralight violins. Those interest me a lot. So maybe we can go to those, and maybe you tell us about them.
Sure, pleasure. Oh, where are they?
They were after that, I think.
Oh, after the...
Yeah, let's see.
And while you're looking for those, I'm just going to put up the poll very quickly in case anyone isn't able to stay afterward for how you all found out about this event. So just a brief poll. And as Joseph's getting up the slide.
Thank you, Julia. This is helpful to us because knowing how to get the word out is important.
Okay, I'm ready anytime.
Okay.
Okay, this is just a nice picture a colleague sent. This is steering wheels of a Mercedes Formula One car from 1954 and 2004. And one is a perfectly recognizable, coolly designed steering wheel with obvious function, and the other to me could be a video game controller or an attack helicopter. I don't know. It just shows how design and high performance thinking transforms objects in extraordinary ways very quickly, especially as soon as science and engineering becomes involved, plus a lot of money thrown at it, which there is in car racing. With violins, you know, the classical violin hasn't really been influenced by any aesthetic movement since the Renaissance, and we're proud of that. I don't know why, but it is interesting to try and I don't know why my screen isn't changing.
There we go. Oh
yeah. So about 30 years ago, a researcher suggested I weigh my violin tops, and the violin, I happened to have a Strad in the shop for the first time. This was in Ann Arbor in the 80s, and we had the top off it to change the bass bar, and I weighed it, and it weighed like, let's say 54 grams, and I weighed one that I was working on, it was 80 grams. I thought, what? That's nothing subtle about that difference. And no one, for some reason, no one ever weighed violin parts. I don't know why. We measured everything else about them. And I started doing this obsessively, and okay, if the difference between old and new could be just the weight of the parts, well, that should be easy to change. So I started understanding what this meant in terms of the physics, but also looking for woods that would give lighter tops. And then I gradually, and this certainly helped the sound of my instruments. And it seemed like the ones with lighter tops sold more quickly and were more enjoyed, especially by soloistic players. And so I went to extremes. What happened if you make something lighter than any old instrument? And I started using carbon fiber and then balsa and all sorts of things, and making really very lightweight instruments. And this is a viola, you know, with wood veneer on the outside and carbon fiber on the inside. And this was just a pile of experimental ones. You really go through a lot of time and work with this, but it's fun. And so it turns out that using balsa, you can make the loudest violin in the world. And so I think I found the limits of power. And but that doesn't mean people want it under their ear. I mean, they already damage your ear. So I realize you don't need that much power, but it's nice to be in a position of having too much and then scaling back, rather than the problem with so many traditional violins. You have too little and you're trying to go forward. So the ultralight idea started from that idea, but it's become lightweight, but not extremely so. But a lot of other design issues, we think of the violin as a perfect design, but in fact, you look at all the things that go wrong with violins. Why not design them out? For example, the chin rest was introduced in the early 1800s and has been a great convenience to violinists, but it's been damaging instruments ever since. The metal clamps, you know, crunch the top and they can distort the ribs, and you know, they're no great thing to look at. So why not make a violin where it's supposed to have a chin rest? This particular one, the chin rest is supported by posts that go through the block, and you can unscrew it from the back, and it sort of floats above there where it's not going to do any damage. And it's lighter in weight and has an elegant look that I like. There's also no end pin. End pins tend to split the instrument, the block anyway, over time, because you've got this wedge going into spruce. This is a metal part, and it's attached with a flexible metal coupling to the tailpiece, so you don't have a tail cord that stretches or breaks. Just simple things that, you know, make life more secure for a player. Also, one of the biggest things that happens with violins is the neck sinks, and that's expensive to redo. It means on the way, the bridge keeps getting cut down, and that changes the sound. It's endless frustration. And one could argue that the evolution of the violin to Baroque to modern had a lot to do with the way the neck was set. The Baroque necks had 3 nails, and they were quick to put together, but they were hellish to repair later. So the modern neck set is much better this way, but this one is, instead of 3 nails, there's 3 screws, one of which you can see there, and that adjusts the fingerboard angle, so you can change, the player can change the height of the strings in a few seconds. There's also another screw you can't see, which changes the inclination from side to side. So it means you can take the instrument apart quickly. You could actually take that neck off and put another one, let's say a Baroque one, on in 5 minutes. It just loosen the strings, undo the screw. And then also the playing action of the violin isn't symmetrical, and often you either, if you make the fingerboard and neck comfortably thin at the bottom, there's not much room. So I decided to widen the treble side and sort of recurve it upwards so that there's no feeling that you're going to slip off the fingerboard. And yeah, both these features have worked very well, and I find that players appreciate them. I think that there's not much market for innovation that's satisfying a need for a maker to be different or to be creative or whatever. Not that those aren't important. What I'm trying to do is solve problems for players, and I think players are quite open-minded. I think my colleagues, violin makers, tend to be more conservative than a lot of the players I met. If it works for them, they're happy to have it. And this is what I call it. The bridge is much lighter, and it lets a lot more brilliance and projection through. So the idea with this is, this has probably too much as is, but I have what I call micro mutes, which you can add. They sort of screw into the side of the bridge. You can't really see the detail there. And so you can incrementally mellow the instrument from, you know, something that would blend in with the mellowest old Italians to something, if you know, at full blast would pretty much dominate any musical context. But again, it gives the player the control. With a traditional violin, it's rather like you buy a stereo and there's no knobs on it. If you want to change the sound, you have to go back to the factory. I would love to see the players having more control. Mm-hmm. This is a slightly simplified scroll, single turn. This is a sort of a neo-Baroque style. I've used this on violas quite a bit. It's lighter in weight, and with viola, the weight at the scroll can make quite a bit of difference. That's another just a fun design. The scroll of the instrument, you can do anything you want. So it's a ripe area to, you know, just have some fun. I think that's all I had there.
Those are beautiful. Let's see, we've got lots of questions in chat. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Oh, I will ask you this one. This one came much earlier. They wanted to know if there were particular strings that you used on the instruments that you made.
Yes, I used Ava Perazzi for many years. First dominant, because when I was a young maker, that was the new string out, and they made a huge difference compared with the wound gut dominant. And then I switched to Ava Perazzi. I like them a lot. And then more recently to Pi. They're a little lower tension, which my instruments don't need the added mass. And so they're a very good string. They also, in my experience, they don't shred as easily. The Ava Perazzi, the A string, tends to shred in no time.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Oh, somebody wants to know who the white bust is behind you.
Oh, yes, that's one of my heroes. And that's actually, was a Christmas present from my wife, who made it. She's a sculptor, among other things, and also a composer.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, there's Fritz Kreisler. Fritz Kreisler over there.
That's great. So, Julia, would you like to make everybody a panelist now, so that if anyone is here who'd like to ask their question in person, turn on their video, turn off their mute?
Sure. And what I would say is, if you aren't able to stay, or you don't feel comfortable turning on your camera, that's fine. I am going to stop the recording in case that changes your mind about that. And for anyone who isn't able to stay, thank you for being with us. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening.
Yes, thank you very much for those of you who joined us and are leaving now. For those of you who are staying around, feel free to turn your camera on and ask away.